Good morning, everybody. Welcome. It's wonderful to see people on a Sunday at 9. I feel like you all get extra credit. You're also here for a really helpful, thoughtful discussion with some experts and some people who are open to more thinking. So part of what I like about this group is no one's an ideologue coming to hammer you with First Amendment theory. It's a group that's continuing to develop its thinking and its practice. Before we start, I wanted to thank Steve Herrick in particular. Steve is representing the American Academy of Religion, and he was part of raising the funds to make the Luce State Department AAR partnership possible. He's an advocate for citizenship and for a healthy planet, and he's been a great part of this team. So thank you, Steve. We are going to organize this morning's meetings by, in the first half, having some pretty informal presentations of each person speaking about how he or she came to be in a position to contribute to the public service policy lens of their study of religion, and also describing the kind of work they did practically and the kind of partnerships that they developed, and maybe raising some questions for their colleagues, because we want to help one another to see where the important differences were and the opportunities that were left unfilled. And then for the second half of the panel, we're going to take some questions and we're going to talk to one another. So please think of yourself as part of this conversation. We really are eager to hear what you have to contribute. I'm going to begin by turning to my left and introducing Evan. Evan, will you tell us a little bit about why you're here and what you do?
Sure. So good morning, everybody. I'm glad I have a microphone and a powerful speaker system because you can hear my voice is a little underperforming right now. So first of all, my name is Evan Berry. I'm a professor of philosophy and religion at American University. I work in the area of religion and the environment, and over the last few years, my research has really taken up questions about the engagement of religious actors with public policy issues connected to climate change. So both the kind of work that those groups do in advocacy circles, the kinds of work that those groups do in disaster relief and humanitarian work, implementation of sustainability projects, and so on. And so first, I'd like to sort of put a caveat at the front end of my remarks that as we began to discuss the possibility of having a panel like this to sort of report back and think out loud about our experience working at the State Department and engage with the Academy and with some other folks who are knowledgeable in this area, I sort of looked at that in advance as an opportunity to process the experience of having taken a sabbatical and instead of sitting in my sweatpants and generating a second book, putting on a suit and leaving the house at like 7:30 in the morning every day, which I'm still sort of kicking myself for in some ways, but then I also think I have quite a lot to reflect on from that experience. And I had imagined that this would be a good marker to sort of push me to have processed the event in some way. And I have to say, I'm still very much processing it. I'm still chewing on what it means and figuring out how to fully integrate it into my own research and teaching life. I think I've found ways to connect my students to opportunities, and I think I've found new questions and ideas, but I'm far from being systematic about it yet. And so I hope that's something that comes up in our conversations today. So given my particular area of expertise, when the call for AAR-Luce Fellowship proposals came out a couple of years ago, I was floored to see that among the topics and areas of particular interest listed there was religion and climate change. I was both pleasantly surprised and very surprised by that. And so I thought that sort of felt to me like an invitation to see what kind of role I might be able to play. And as they say, the rest is history. One thing I would want to say that we sort of discussed the idea of putting it on the table, what kinds of qualifications and experiences can be helpful for scholars as they think about making a move into a policy domain or into a government position. And in this case, the kind of work that I do best aligns with what is in State Department jargon called functional work, right? Issue area topics of concern rather than regions of concern. So much like the way that the academy is broken up, there's sort of a hierarchy and a set of tensions about how functional and regional issues intersect. And so my knowledge and my work at State were almost fully on the so-called functional side. Also in terms of the communications work, one thing that I have come to appreciate and continue to think about as a kind of method of disseminating academic work are the kind of communications and dissemination strategies that one uses in a place like the State Department or in other government agencies, right? Short memos, organization of events that are designed specifically to catalyze partnerships that you anticipate brokering in advance. These are not necessarily the same kinds of strategies that people in the university world think to deploy, and I'm glad to have sort of learned about those. And I think that sort of practicing communication skills, both in written and in oral terms, is something that's really important for thinking about, if you're good at those things, those might be opportunities for you to bring your academic work into a policy sphere. I also would say that a big part of my so-called qualifications for this position had to do with the research networks that I had established, right? The way that a city like Washington, D.C. works, and this is true in other policy domains, is that it's complicated networks of actors and being able to have personal relationships with people who can help make the connections you need. So simply knowing a lot of the folks who work in the faith-based organization advocacy space and having sort of a good sense of what organizations were playing an active role in that area, I think was helpful in getting me started, not from zero, but to get a little bit of a running start. I also wanted to say a quick something about the kind of work that you actually do on a day-to-day basis, just to give folks a sense about this in case it's something they're curious about. So maybe I would offer a couple of examples, one of them meant to be more on the positive side, and one of them meant to sort of be a cautionary note to folks who are used to working with the kind of freedom and autonomy that comes with academic life. So first, the cautionary note. So relatively early on in my experience, we in the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, where both Jerome and I were placed, had the opportunity to think about developing an event where the Secretary of State would have swung by a side event organized by faith-based organizations at the margins of an international environmental gathering. And this would have been a situation where the Secretary would have entered the room, shaken some hands, taken a picture, and left. 20 minutes tops, 15 minutes probably more likely. And we were sort of invited to put together a package describing what this would look like, which meant that we had to vet the folks who would have been in the room. We needed to get a sort of a spatial orientation of the room and sort of make a plan about who would be where. We had to create a scenario that was minute by minute how that would happen, and like literally scripting every step of that. And that was just to propose to the Secretary's office what that event would have been like. And ultimately, it wasn't successful, and this photo opportunity didn't come to pass. And at the time, because I was relatively, I think, new to the position, I found that really frustrating. I basically spent a week putting together documents for somebody else's 15 minutes that never came to pass. But I also realized that that's very much, like, every 15 minutes of the Secretary of State's life is scripted at that kind of a level, and there's people trying to build the right kinds of connections and put him in the right kinds of spaces to make that possible. I also take it as a learning experience, right? We come to think that our work is really about our ideas and their realization in the world, and that's hardly the way that government functions. And I think there's a value in that, right? There's a value in sort of institutional humility. The flip side would be about some of the positives, right? So capturing ideas in succinct form on paper is one of the primary things that academic fellows at the State Department do, and there are actually quite a few folks sort of working in government with academic backgrounds trying to bring their knowledge to bear on particular issues. So generating cables, which are essentially memos about a particular issue, or helping draft speeches, or generating policy advisement on a particular issue. Those kind of work can be really rewarding when a snippet that you put together ends up finding its way into a speech, or when a cable or a memo that you wrote gets filed away on a permanent basis. And so those count as real victories. And I think that even if it's difficult to look back and say with any kind of specificity that the AAR-Luce Fellowship project moved policy in any measurable, externally measurable way, I do think we can sort of count these little victories as things that will have a shelf life and will lay the groundwork for future work in this area. So I think I'll just wrap it up there. Thanks.
Thanks, Evan.
Good morning, and thank you all for coming. And I wanted again to reiterate my thanks to Steve Herrick and the AAR and the Luce Foundation for both putting together today's panel and for funding our experience at the State Department. I was lucky to have Evan as I guess my office mate for the time. I was in the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, and moving from a situation of being a professor where you have your own office to the more open office plan that we had at the State Department may have been, I thought would be the biggest challenge in moving to government, but in fact I found it to be a delightful experience and one that I continue to cherish to this day. So my background, I come from the study of the relationship of religion and politics, both on a theoretical and practical level. On the theoretical level, I've done much work in the study of political theology, the study of how religious traditions and communities understand the nature of political life, the laws that they live within, the state, and so forth, and how these ideas have played out in reality, particularly in changing political situations. And I've also spent some time studying what scholars call civil religion, the discourses and practices created and endorsed by the state and its actors and representatives. And in both cases, have a particular background in modern Jewish thought and a constellation of issues relating to the Jewish religion, the question of the relationship of the Jewish religion and the pressures of modernity, anti-Semitism, Jewish nationalism, Zionism, and so forth. And from this background, when I came to the State Department, there were a number of different both functional and regional areas that I was able to add value to. In particular, I spent a good deal of my time working to advise the Special Envoy to monitor and counter anti-Semitism. And this is a special position that was created by Congress back in the early 2000s to essentially provide a person and a office within the State Department to look at the issue of anti-Semitism globally, to monitor it, and to work to figure out strategies to combat the phenomena where it occurs. And in this capacity, we work to engage civil society actors, mostly in Europe, but also in North Africa, to develop collaborative projects and to invest in long-term educational strategies to counter the underlying drivers of anti-Semitism in those areas. I also worked on the issue of refugees, and particularly the integration of religious minorities, mostly coming from Islamic countries in Europe. And training to help. One of the functions of the Office of Religion and Global Affairs was to try to make the State Department and its embassies and posts around the world smarter in how they thought about religion, and to think of us as a kind of internal think tank to develop materials such as case studies to sort of deepen and complicate the way in which diplomats and people working at the State Department think about the relationship of religion and religious communities and religious actors and our foreign policy priorities. And finally, one of the roles of the Office of Religion and Global Affairs was to act as a liaison between religious actors and organizations wishing to engage with U.S. foreign policy and the State Department. So we served as a kind of front door to the State Department, to a whole range of both national and international religious organizations. So that's kind of the map of some of the issues that I worked in. I think maybe I'll talk a little bit about what my day-to-day life was, because I had a somewhat broader package of tasks than Evan did. One of the, to start with the advising the Special Envoy to monitor and counter anti-Semitism, one of the things that we wanted to think about was, A, what were the perennial issues that were driving anti-Semitism in countries that we had good relationships with? And so in what ways that we could understand what is causing the phenomena on the ground, and what tools that we had in the State Department to work with those governments and work with the non-governmental organizations to deal with the problem. And one of the things that we did was to essentially try to put together a comprehensive database of civil society organizations around the world that were working on issues of anti-Semitism and other forms of religious hate and persecution. And then to work with those organizations to develop collaborative projects and to invest in strategies to do this. So we found organizations around the world, in France, in Belgium, in Germany, in Morocco, and we spent time learning from them, hearing what their issues were on the ground, because the issues were different from place to place, and finding out ways that we could invest with them, to find out if there's something that we could do with an embassy or a consulate, or to put them in touch with other organizations in their country or around the world. As far as making the State Department smarter on religion, one of the key things that we would do on the day-to-day basis was to advise officials and people out in the field on the particular religious dynamics and engagement opportunities that they would face. And this would be something as simple as briefing a diplomat about to go out to a post on the particular issues that he or she might face, say in Israel and Palestine. So we spent a lot of time both putting together briefings that we were asked to do, and also reaching out to diplomats and to other functional areas within the department to offer our advice and expertise on these issues. And thirdly, Evan already mentioned working collaboratively on putting together memos, speeches, documents for the principals in the department. And I think, you know, having worked on a number of memos and speeches and other forms of texts, gives you a different understanding of authorship. No matter how hard you work in drafting a proposal or drafting a memo or drafting a speech, there will be at least a dozen other pairs of eyes on that document who have equities in that issue, who need to clear on whatever you're doing. And sometimes we would be asked to clear on the memos and documents of other bureaus and other individuals as well. So this was a two-way, or one would say a multi-way street. And I think my study of the documentary hypothesis in the Hebrew Bible was very helpful here in keeping track of, you know, who's saying what and why. There is an institutional memory that you're working within, that nothing, in a sense, nothing is new under the sun. All of these issues have been worked on at some point, and different bureaus, different both functional bureaus and regional bureaus, have different priorities and different takes on a particular issue. So it's important that when even something as simple as an appointment request, that organization A wants to meet with the Secretary of State or an undersecretary or some principal in the State Department, we would have to write a memo on why that should or should not happen, and that memo would have to be looked at by all of the other bureaus that had equities in that relationship. And that could be a frustrating process when you need something signed off at the end of business and people haven't sent you back the email or aren't answering their phones. So there's this bureaucratic dimension that took up a certain amount of time that I actually found at times quite frustrating and other times quite fascinating. And you learn a lot about the mechanics of how the building works and also how these issues have developed over time. I mean, how hard it is to even make a small change in policy at that level. Let me stop there and pass on to Todd now, and I think we can talk more in the conversation.
Good morning. Is this on? Good morning. Thank you again to Steve Herrick. I want to echo what my colleagues have said as well, to the Luce Foundation for what was an incredible opportunity. I sort of feel like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and certainly not something I'd ever planned to do back when I was in graduate school. The paths you take in your career are sometimes quite unexpected and yet rewarding. And I do appreciate the AAR, the Luce Foundation, for creating these pathways. My academic area of expertise is Islamophobia. The fear, hostility, hatred of Muslims and of Islam, the exclusionary and discriminatory practices that emanate from this fear and hostility. I study this topic primarily as a religious historian. I pay a lot of attention to modern religious history, particularly, draw in sociology as well. And I'm interested on both sides of the Atlantic, how Islamophobia has evolved and developed, and the connections between the two, which I don't know if scholars pay enough attention to, what happens in Europe in terms of Muslim communities can affect what happens in the United States and vice versa, politically and otherwise. In the sort of several years leading up to my time in the State Department last year, my research had increasingly moved in the direction of public scholarship. I have a lot of passion about public scholarship, translating what I'm writing, how I'm speaking to a general audience. I have strong ethical commitments about Islamophobia. I'm not neutral on the topic, and frankly, I don't want any of you to be neutral on the topic either. And that's some of what fed my desire to go into the State Department and to try to have this opportunity. In terms of doing another form of public scholarship and engaging a different kind of audience in a different way than I would have been able to do had I stayed, again, on sabbatical in my own home. Unlike my colleagues, I was assigned not to a functional bureau, but to a regional bureau or office. I was assigned to the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, and I worked in an office called the Office of Policy and Global Issues, focusing specifically on advising on anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia in Europe, particularly in terms of how it intersected with human rights issues and freedom of religion, as well as counterterrorism and countering violent extremism initiatives, the acronym CVE, which we use a lot on the government side. But to what extent were Muslim communities being engaged and processed and thought of by the US government and their European allies in terms of potential security threats and engaged accordingly? And I was, before and after the State Department, I was very critical of that model of the primary lens through which to engage Muslim communities from government entities is through viewing Muslims as latent security threats that need to be managed accordingly. So a lot of my advising was hitting a common theme throughout the year to my colleagues at the State Department. Very different from, or somewhat different from Evan and Jerome. I wasn't in an office full of other people passionate about religion and its intersection with foreign policy. I was a bit of an outlier in my area, and there's upsides and downsides to that. I actually never have told these two this, but I was a lot of times envious of, oh, it must be fun up in the RGA office, right? You know, what just talking about religion all day. And the religion nerd in me really had some withdrawal symptoms for a while in my beginning phase of the State Department, because in my day-to-day work, I had people who were interested in what I did, but they didn't have the kind of passion about religion, and religion as a social political phenomenon that I imagine people upstairs did in the Religion Global Affairs office. So I sometimes had that envy, but I think there's actually was a lot of value for me to be where I was and to be that conversation partner for a lot of my colleagues for whom it wasn't sort of natural to think about some of the questions about religion's intersection with politics and engaging religious actors that I was so passionate about. So I appreciated that opportunity in many ways. In terms of the sort of stuff I did on a regular basis, and I actually had to split this in half. I was there for about half my time was the end of the Obama administration, the other half was the beginning of the Trump administration. Just remember what I said in the beginning, I study Islamophobia. The way that was engaged and the way I had to deal with that and manage that in terms of the State Department side was a little bit different in one of those than in the other. In the first part of my time there, a lot of my work was research on what U.S. embassies in Europe were doing to engage Muslim communities. What sort of programs were they initiating? Who were they partnering with in terms of governments, NGOs, and that sort of thing? And I had a particular lens to which I was doing this work. To what extent were engaging Muslim communities and programs for engaging Muslim communities primarily being driven by, again, countering violent extremism? And to what extent then could I give some recommendations or advice on other ways to engage Muslim communities that didn't have CVE or counterterrorism as the starting point? You know, there was a lot of material that I ended up gathering over a lot of different regions of Europe, so it was very interesting for me to sort of see what the U.S. government via our embassies had been doing, some of it which was quite impressive, some of it was moving in the right direction, some of which was starting from a CVE paradigm, and I was able to get the lay of the land in that regard, and that was a lot of my work. I also gave feedback on speeches and memos and weighed in on various documents circulating through the State Department that would have intersected in some way with anti-Muslim discrimination or racism in Europe and maybe in some cases elsewhere. After January or so, my workload in some of the ways decreased. I don't think I was actually unique in the State Department in that regard. I'm not sure even right now that's unique in terms of what was really a bustling sort of place after January. There was a lot of rethinking, reorganizing that's still taking place if you follow the news about the State Department. But I actually had some interesting opportunities in that second half of my time at the State Department in the Trump administration that I would not have foreseen. And I'm glad I did this. In fact, if I can be just honest and blunt, on the evening of November the 8th, as the election results were coming in and it seemed like the election was going to go a certain way, I turned to my wife and I said, you know, I'm about to have the most ridiculous job in Washington, D.C., an advisor on Islamophobia and the Trump administration. I mean, you can't make that up, right? And I had some misgivings about, do I keep doing this? Do I reach out to Steve and AAR and say, can I do something else for the second half of my time? Is there maybe another think tank or another government organization? I couldn't quite figure out if I should go forward with this. And it was a fleeting thought, or a fleeting thought for 5 days. But I'm glad I stuck with it. I was there in an advisory capacity anyway. I didn't have any power. I could give advice, and that advice could be ignored, and I really thought of it that way. But better to be inside than outside at that moment, I thought, particularly in that political transition. So I did stay, and some opportunities did arise that I was grateful for. Some of which had to do with structural changes. When oftentimes, you know, when there's the inauguration of a new president, you have the political appointees resign either before or right around inauguration time. And in theory, the new Secretary of State makes new political appointees. That's also been in the media a good bit since the Trump administration began, and a lot of that hasn't been made. So in my bureau, the acting Assistant Secretary of State took a lot of interest in my work. A little bit more so than it had been the case in the Obama administration, and maybe it was because of the political climate, but I ended up consulting with him, or he had me consult with him quite a bit in the last 5 months or so of my time there, and particularly focused on language around terrorism and Islam, coming out of an election cycle where a lot of candidates had been using language like radical Islamic terrorism. And he wanted me to help him brainstorm and think through ways to offer alternate language that when then he was briefing the Secretary of State, the new Secretary of State, maybe could nudge the Secretary of State in a different direction than had been the case certainly during the election cycle. And that was a very practical assignment I was given, with some ambivalence I had about it as well. It was not actually, you know, what's the alternate language you use about terrorism involving people with a Muslim background that doesn't come across as Islamophobic or mischaracterizing the nature of this form of violence, but could also be heard in the current political environment. That was actually an extraordinary task to try to figure out. But I had that opportunity in a way that I would not have had otherwise. And did other things in terms of analyzing the speeches of the President and the Secretary of State and the way they talked about Islam, and particularly the way they might have related Islam to violence, that I could then analyze and sort of give my take on that for others in the European Bureau. And I was doing a lot more of that kind of work the second half of my time than the first half. And I also had the opportunity at the very end of my time in May to travel to some US embassies, particularly in Germany and Belgium, to speak to embassy staffs and personnel and other publics in Europe, including young Muslims, young Muslim adults in Europe about Islamophobia. Ironically, they wanted me more often than not to speak about Islamophobia in America. So I go over there to Europe and they want me to talk about Islamophobia here in some very interesting political times, right? And so that in itself, maybe I can talk about more later, but was a very interesting experience to engage on Islamophobia and again, in a particular presidential administration, and doing that in my capacity as representing the US government. In terms of the challenges from this work, it took me a while to adjust to the State Department. The move from being a professor on a liberal arts college campus to being a US government employee was a little bit of a shock to my system in terms of the way things were done, the way things were communicated, echoing what Jerome said in terms of you write a memo to someone, you know, it's not, you don't just click send. Sometimes I wish I could have just clicked send and it goes up to the person I want it to go to, but no, a lot of people have to jump in on this and vet it, and you know, I found that to take some adjusting. And the challenges I mentioned a while ago of trying to translate the work I did into language and discourses that could be heard and processed by the US government and political appointees and others in the State Department. The main example I can give there is this language of radical Islamic terrorism. It actually was very difficult to find language I was comfortable with to suggest to the European Bureau and the Acting Assistant Secretary of State that I thought also, you know, could be heard. There are lots of ways I talk about it in my public scholarship, but the Acting Assistant Secretary was wanting, well, what will be heard by Secretary Tillerson? What can he process and potentially, you know, start to incorporate into his own language, as opposed to what do I just personally feel it would be the better way to do this? And that's a different question to ask of me than I'm normally accustomed to being asked in terms of that. And it was a great exercise in many ways, but I did worry at times if in translating my public scholarship to this particular audience, if I was sacrificing something in the process, and it raised some moral concerns for me at certain times, and I want to be open about that. And I could mention some other things too, but I briefly want to touch on the opportunities that arose from this as well. The collaborative writing I thought was quite interesting after a while, once I got used to it, that there were 12 other people weighing in on everything you wrote. But you know, we as professors oftentimes are used to being siloed in our writing, and yeah, we have people weigh in and peer reviews and that sort of thing. But this is a different kind of collaborative writing, I would say, that, you know, by the end of my time there, I was more accustomed to it, and I thought maybe there was something we as academics could learn from that kind of writing, even though there's something that's lost in it as well. Sometimes what you start with and what ends up getting cleared are almost two different documents. But the collaborative nature and having to negotiate and content sometimes I found to be humbling and constructive. The opportunity to not just deconstruct problematic ways of talking about Muslims or Islam, but offering possible solutions to this. You know, again, as a scholar, I'm very trained and skilled in deconstructing things. But in the U.S. government, you can't ever just stop there. You have to offer solutions or possibilities, and you will not gain much of an audience for long if you don't turn the corner on that. And so having to constantly not just say this is the problem, but here are some ways forward is very good. I think more of us as professors and scholars should be pushed to do that with our work. I ultimately saw my work as a way of raising consciousness about Islamophobia, and in many ways to have this opportunity with this audience is very helpful. I tell my students all the time that one of the things I want them to get out of any course they take from me is they expand their conversation partners, even if the texts they're reading are written by dead people, right? They expand their conversation partners, and expanding their conversation partners, it really does help them get a better sense of who they are, what they themselves believe, and also to learn from others and grow in that sense. And I saw my time in the State Department as expanding my conversation partners, people I didn't have day-to-day contact with, who did look at the world a little bit differently than I have been trained to look at the world. And that to me was a tremendous opportunity, and I'm grateful for that. And my final question I sort of leave to really everyone up here is, and thinking about this kind of work of bridging the gap between the study of religion and policy making, is to the extent that you've done this work, does it matter? The classic "so what" question of academia, right? But I think that question applies here. Did it make a difference? Do you feel you made a difference? I'm still asking myself that question today, and I wonder if my answer 5 years from now might be a little bit different than it is just 6 months or so from this experience. But I am curious as to what others up here have to say about the "so what" question. Thank you.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Thank you as well. I echo the sentiments of my previous panelists, thanking the fellow panelists, our chair, and also the Luce Foundation. Although I'm not one of the individuals who went through the Luce program that we've been discussing, we do thank the Luce Foundation at the Fletcher School. They are supporting a religious literacy initiative as part of our broader religion, law, and diplomacy initiative. So I'm happy to thank them for recognizing that in a place like the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, which is where I teach at Tufts University, there's a real value for our students and also for our faculty in thinking about the connections between religion and international relations, both on the theory side but also the practice side. I'm a political scientist by training, and I come to religion in terms of the issues and the regions on which I work. I'm trained as a comparativist, and I think that's a kind of hybridist, and by that I simply mean someone who has always been interested in interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary work when it comes to studying religion from the disciplinary space of political science. Maybe that's due to my master's training at the Fletcher School, and also then to the doctoral work at MIT, where, although in political science, I wrote a dissertation on church-state relations in the 1980s in Greece, and the way in which religion affected the democratization process there. And MIT was perhaps counterintuitively a very hospitable environment for doing that kind of cross-disciplinary work. I'm especially interested in issues of religion, security, and democracy, and more specifically, the ways in which the origins, the sustainability, the durability of religious pluralism in various regions of the world contributes to democracy building and also contributes to stability and different kinds of security. I work primarily on, depending on how you think about history, the post-Byzantine or post-Ottoman spaces, which means that I work mainly on the Near East and Southeastern Europe. So there's a lot of fruitful kind of possibility for the work, the theoretical issues I'm interested in. Currently working on two projects. One is a project on migration, religion, and security in Europe and Eurasia, and in particular looking at how human mobility flows from Eurasia into Europe, or from the Middle East into Europe, are reshaping the way in which policymakers think about the relationship between religion and security. And the second is looking at a project on what I call geopolitics and orthodoxy, and orthodox geopolitics. And I'm very interested in the way in which classical geopolitics and critical geopolitics is shaping the way in which the global Orthodox Church engages in international relations and also practices geopolitics internally in terms of its own, I would say, ecclesiastical politics. So that's what I'm currently working on. I served, in terms of how I come to this panel, I served from 2004 to 2012 on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And so I served 4 two-year terms. That commission is an independent U.S. government agency, and it was formed in 1998. It was established in 1998 with the passage of the International Religious Freedom Act, probably the last unanimous thing that both houses of Congress have done in our recent history. That agency was created along with the IRF office, the International Religious Freedom Office at the State Department, as well as a position on the National Security Council for an expert on religious freedom. Interestingly enough, since the passage of the IRF legislation in 1998, that NSC position has yet to be filled. So I served from 2004 to 2012, which meant I served under 2 different administrations, and it was quite fascinating to see both the elements of difference but also the elements of continuity between 2 administrations, the Bush 43 and Obama administrations, that on the face of it had very different approaches to thinking about I think religion in the world and also religion in U.S. foreign policy and the promotion and protection of religious freedom. But in terms of their actual policy, they were very interesting, and not always from my perspective as either an academic or a policymaker, very interesting elements of continuity. And I also served from 2011 to 2015 in an advisory capacity on the Secretary of State's Working Group on Religion and U.S. Foreign Policy, and that was established by Secretary Clinton and continued under Secretary Kerry. So that's the framework in which, in terms of public service and public policy and international policy experience, I had the opportunity to really get a bird's eye view of the way in which our foreign policy establishment thinks about how religion matters, and more specifically how religious freedom matters. I would say that in terms of the policy establishment, some takeaways for me, and this became clear even as I entered, began my service on the USERF. I think it was very interesting to watch the ways in which the things that we talk about, epistemic frameworks and models of modernity, models of secularization, how those were quite actively at work, and I think remain quite actively at work in the policy establishment. Sometimes in an examined way, but more often than not, I would say, in terms of very deep, unexamined, but quite active assumptions that began to be, at least in terms of the work that I did on the USERF, rendered far more explicit. And I would say most specifically, this came to questions on the way in which language like secular and modern gets used in the foreign policy establishment. Ideas about the way in which, the long-standing, I think, views about the way in which secular is a good thing. Secular always means greater degrees of democracy. Secularity and democracy always go hand in hand. And one of the things that became quite clear early on in my tenure on the commission was the need to unpack that assumption. And it was quite, I think, counterintuitive for some of the people that I served with, but more generally, I would say, in the foreign policy establishment. And seeing the way in which the language of the academy and the language of social science and political science research is used really as the kind of lingua franca for a lot of the policy discussions was quite interesting. And I think in terms of the work at in the RGA office and also in the International Religious Freedom Office, the recognition there and the kinds of work that you all do, the recognition there that in fact it is important to kind of unpack those assumptions, because they have long had, I think, very strong effects on our foreign policy. That was one of the ways that I immediately saw the sort of the porousness of the boundaries between the academic space and the policy space. Another area in which I saw that as well was in terms of discussions about security, looking in particular at the ways in which stable or unstable security environments affect the protection and the durability of religious freedom regimes, and vice versa, looking at the way in which strong religious freedom regimes help to create stable security environments, recognizing that there's a kind of reflexivity at work. That was something that, again, in terms of the policy space, began to be a central part of our conversations on the USERF. Also recognizing the work that we did, which involved a lot of travel, international travel, to investigate empirical and also alleged violations of religious freedom, beginning to see that when we speak about security, although I would say there's been a tendency, and unfortunately I think that's been intensified, at least in the first, 10 months into this new administration, the tendency to think about security in terms of violence, in terms of terrorism, and certainly in terms of the language about Islamist terrorism. The flip side of that was a recognition, by looking at religious freedom regimes, recognizing that there are very different kinds of security, types of security, but they're all interrelated. There are, the ways in which states protect their borders. Then there are non-traditional security threats, some of which we've been discussing, but also the issue of human security. And one of the things that I think became very apparent in terms of the service on the Commission was the recognition that human security and international religious freedom are intrinsically related, freedom from want, violence, and fear. Yet another kind of observation in terms of the linkages between the academic space and the policy space that I experienced and observed was the real need for what I mentioned earlier in thanking Luce, the need for improved religious literacy. And by that, I would say simply on the foreign policy side, a much better and more systematic training for our foreign service officers, but also for our senior policymakers in thinking about what is religion, how do we understand religious ideas, religious institutions, organizations, actors, the importance in particular of religious leadership and who interprets and monopolizes the interpretation of a religious message. And then finally, thinking as a comparativist, basic training on what we could call comparative religions, to move away from the kind of essentializing language that I would say, unfortunately, continues to be a challenge when we think about religion and foreign policy, but relates very much to the areas and the regions in which I do most of my academic research. And I think in particular, when we talk about the Middle East, the kind of default language of the Middle East as the Muslim Middle East, the Arab Middle East, the Middle East is a space, a regional space that's been, continuously affected for the last 70 years by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That kind of language tends to occlude and largely miss the very important, I think, religious pluralism that has long characterized the region, and the causes for the ebb and flow, and more recently, I would say, really for the last 100 years since the formation of states in the region, the homogenization of what was a religiously plural space. The causes for that very much, I think, shape the way in which we think about the policy choices that can both build robust religious freedom regimes, but also encourage stable security environments. And I noticed again this issue of language come up repeatedly in terms of the work that we did, both in terms of the on-the-ground investigation that we did, but also in terms of the mandate for the commission, which was to report to the Congress, the Secretary of State, and the White House on religious freedom violations around the world, and then to make these legal designations of countries of particular concern, which are countries of that commit systematic and egregious violations of religious freedom. So to sort of sum that up, the issue of vocabulary, language, nomenclature, and the underlying assumptions associated with that language that we have seen go through, I would say, a kind of, minor or maybe major revolution in the academy over the last 20 years. I saw the belatedness of the change or the critical approach to the use of that language in the policy space, but nonetheless a kind of openness to explore that once sort of put on the table. Let's see, in terms of what this experience I think brings to both my academic research but also my life in the classroom, I would say that the service really has enriched and made me a better academic in the classroom. It really allows me to sort of demonstrate through example the ways in which the knowledge regimes that we use in political science when it comes to religion really are active. They're very present in policy making, and so the endless amounts of research on secularization theory, the critical reevaluation of secularization theory in the academy, that really is a part of the foreign policy establishment. And so to be able to sort of demonstrate that to students, I think is very useful. And frankly, also the ability to bring in experts who work on the kinds of issues that I might teach about in a course on geopolitics, religion, and security in Eurasia, or democratization in the Middle East. That makes a big difference for students to be able to access experts who are actually, doing this in the policy space. A couple of other just general observations. I think that although, from the policy side, going as an academic onto the commission, that commission is comprised of 9 private citizens. They are appointed by members of the Senate, the House, and the White House. They run the gamut from faith practitioners to attorneys with expertise in international law or religious freedom law, and also include individuals from the NGO world. There's also a smattering of academics who have cycled through the commission. Coming onto that commission as an academic, I felt a sense of skepticism from fellow commissioners about, can you transform your egghead as an academic into a policymaker, and oftentimes a sense that my observations or comments were, I would hear people say they're too theoretical, but there was nonetheless a willingness to sort of, engage on whether or not, these are abstractions. Again, issues of essentializing language, issues of how we use terms. The flip side of that is how fellow academics perceive and think about the work in public service and in the policy environment. And I would say that there's an equally healthy skepticism, if not even a greater intractability, when it comes to thinking that service in the policy space and in the diplomatic space is actually useful as a scholar. I would say there's still a kind of there's a kind of chronic question mark about whether or not service in the policy world makes you, a better and more robust academic, or somehow has contaminated you by virtue of participation in the policy space. And likewise, coming back to the academy out of the experiences on the commission and the Secretary of State's working groups. I would also say that there is, although we speak a lot in the Academy about cross-disciplinary research, I would say that there still is a very, very urgent need for more systematic and greater collaboration, in particular between departments of political science or schools of international public policy on the one hand, and departments of religion, and also seminaries and vocational spaces and religious educational spaces that train faith-based leaders. There's still a kind of silo effect, I would say, at work in the academy, notwithstanding greater evidence of cross-disciplinary research. So I guess two final comments. One is the importance of the importance, again, of encouraging students who have a commitment to robust academic research and scholarship to also think about the possibility of public service and the work that they can do in the policy space. That there are multiple tracks, and choosing one doesn't necessarily close off the other, because I think students oftentimes feel that whether it's for a master's or a PhD, they're forced to make a choice of either an academic trajectory or a policy trajectory. And I think it's very important, and all of us can probably attest to that, to encourage them to think that it's possible to do both. And then finally, the other is a more kind of, I would say, personal contemporary observation. And that is, again, the ways in which my own training as a comparativist who also works on international relations and works on religion and geopolitics and security, the way in which our own politics, domestic politics in the United States, if we think about the fields in political science, the subdivisions in political science of IR, comparative American politics, etc. One of the things that I observed is that a lot of what we think goes on out there when it comes to religious freedom and security, when it comes to the intersection between religion, democracy, and security, a lot of what we think goes on out there, we see more and more in terms of our own politics and our own institutions of governance. And by that, I would say that in the worst cases of violations of religious freedom around the world, we see great evidence of essentializing language, othering of either other religious communities or denominations within religious communities. We see polarization of politics and unwillingness to negotiate. And unfortunately, I would say that a lot of what we think is not part of the American political reality and social reality, we're now seeing, quite sharply in terms of our country. And I would suggest that that's not simply an expression of where we are right now, but these have been long trends that we haven't really been willing to examine. And working in a kind of dialogical and cooperative manner with different U.S. government agencies while on the commission, engaging with Congress, it was very obvious that a lot of those features that I think we are now very concerned with in terms of American politics and society that we oftentimes associated with the international arena are evident for us. And I think the connections between religion and politics really throw that into sharp relief. And so I wouldn't necessarily have been able, I think, to think about that as, as clearly from my own perspective had I not served on the commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Robert?
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Rob Albro. I'm an academic social scientist trained in sociocultural anthropology. I'm a bit of an outlier on the panel, but I think it will become clear how I might fit in. Not having had significant professional time in and around some corner or bureau of the Department of State. But what I want to do is offer a complementary case from the discipline of anthropology, primarily in terms of my own engagement through the Professional Association of Anthropologists, the American Anthropological Association, as it was trying to come to terms with increased engagement from military security, diplomacy entities in the US government at a moment when anthropology was increasingly seen as a kind of an asset from that direction in the mid-2000s and forward in the ongoing global war on terror and in the context of then ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I'll just quickly tell that story, and then I will happily amplify as people have any interest in hearing more. In 2005-07, when I was serving as the chair of the AAA's Committee for Human Rights, I was asked to participate in a commission on anthropology's engagement with U.S. security and intelligence communities, and eventually ended up chairing that commission. At a moment where, to put it mildly, there was significant controversy among the membership of the AAA around whether or not and under what circumstances it might be possible for specific anthropologists to work in any kind of capacity with or on questions of relevance to the US government as it was prosecuting those wars. The discipline of anthropology, I should say, has had a long history of deep ambivalence with working with the U.S. national security state, and this was just one, I would say, kind of particularly punctuated moment in that longer historical arc. In the mid-2000s, there were an array of programs and goals that that military security, intelligence, and diplomacy assets had that made anthropology suddenly interesting. The two obvious and primary ones being its peculiar methodology of participant observation ethnography, and then its focus on some kind of cultural expertise. From the point of view of DoD, for example, anthropology was understood to be, a cultural science, the science that understood how to help us understand cultural questions better. And this was all happening when there was a broad shift in the strategic footing around those conflicts and a new doctrinal emphasis on counterinsurgency, which is a kind of culture-centric war fighting, one might say, where the focus is on engaging with civilian non-combatants and winning hearts and minds and so forth and so on. And so there were a variety of different moving parts across this vast array of agencies and organizations and entities. And so I'll just mention a few to give you a sense of the landscape. Some of these were curricular in nature, focusing on ways in which training and education capacity could be improved around questions of cultural competence. Some of these were operational in nature. Some of you have probably heard about the Human Terrain System program, which was a program stood up in 2005 to embed anthropological expertise in frontline combat units in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And that became a kind of a touchstone for debate, sometimes quite sharp, in the discipline around what was anthropology doing in this regard and what did it mean for anthropologists to be present in these arrangements. Research capacity building. The Office of the Secretary of Defense, for example, organized something called the Minerva Initiative, which provided funding for very kind of anthropological type projects and other kinds of things, and many more in different kinds of forms of engagements and activity. The commission that I eventually chaired was really just an effort by the AAA to get up to speed on these diverse developments and on the invitations that were at that time being extended to the discipline as a whole and to specific anthropologists to cooperate or collaborate with counterparts in government around these questions. And at the same time, so in other words, both to describe what these were to a group of folks, professional anthropologists who for several generations had not had much truck with this part of government, broadly conceived, at least since the Vietnam era, which was an equally contentious period, not surprisingly, and who had very little idea of what was being asked of them or what was involved or what was happening on the one hand, and then on the other hand, strong concern and sense of, and set of internal critiques by groups of anthropologists around the appropriateness of disciplinary involvement, the uses of methodologies like ethnography, and the applications of anthropological knowledge production, both in its generic sense of some idea of the acquisition of cultural expertise, but also a kind of a deeper understanding of, on the part of DoD, DOS, and other entities about the cultures and religions of the Middle East. So very quickly, what did we do as a commission? We existed for some years, and we were basically a kind of group of folks, some from applied worlds of anthropology, some from academic worlds of anthropology, some with a foot in some of these agencies and organizations, some completely outside them, trying to articulate an agenda for the association and to make some constructive suggestions about what the association should be thinking about and might consider moving forward in saying something more substantive around sort of policy, if you will, for anthropologists. So we generated a series of blog posts. We routinely published in the monthly anthropology news. We held numerous public forums, sometimes within these spaces, sometimes outside of them, sometimes on university campuses, sometimes not. We eventually produced 2 comprehensive reports for the AAA on ethical considerations around these forms of engagement, which was the first report published in 2007, and then specifically in 2009 on the human terrain system and whether or not it was an appropriate activity for anthropologists, or could even be called anthropology. In that latter case, the report concluded that no, it couldn't, but also described in detail what the set of issues were that it seemed to us were entailed in a discussion about why that was perhaps inappropriate for a professional anthropologist. So I'll mention just a few of some of the key issues that were raised by members and in our work together on the commission and subsequently. There were an array of critical issues, primarily phrased in terms of ethical concerns and in debates about anthropology's engagement with the national security state. And these included, inter alia, in no particular order, the professional ethical injunction to do no harm, what that means in a conflict zone, the question of transparency versus secrecy, of data, but also of research agendas. This includes obvious problems around working in or with classified environments, and questions of methods and sources, and to what extent one can be transparent, and whether or not it's inherently problematic to engage in non-transparent forms of research or knowledge production. The problem of compartmentalization, I would like to go back to that later if you're interested, because I see that as a particularly interesting issue, by which I mean when you work in these kinds of settings, it's often the case that the specific tasks that you might be given are not themselves complete, or the entire task. You might just be working on some part of a larger agenda, but you might not be altogether aware of what that agenda is. So what does it mean to perform specific activities for some broader goal of which you might not be fully apprised? The difficulties of things like obtaining informed consent, if what you're doing is a research type activity in an environment like a conflict zone that is, some might argue, inherently coercive, and therefore, it's impossible to obtain informed consent. And a little less obviously perhaps, and it's been touched on by some of my colleagues in their work at State, engagement with often well-intentioned counterparts in and across various of these agencies, where they're asking for your participation in and help or expertise in understanding better how to deal with questions of, say, religious identity in operational terms, where that is from the outset framed perhaps as an assumption, as some kind of problem to be solved. And what does it mean when you start with this idea of this being Islam as some sort of problem you have to solve? These were all on the table, and there were many more issues. I'm moving very rapidly through what was a rather complicated set of discussions. Just to kind of finish, I'm offering that example as kind of one institutional case of the way that Professional Social Science Association was brought into and engaged with the national security state, including the Department of State, but not only, and what that's meant for me. So I've been in the Washington, D.C. area since, I grew up in that area, but since 2002, and I should underscore that it's been rather important to have been in D.C. for this role, and the way in which those activities have sort of subsequently shaped an ongoing role that I've played from time to time, sometimes more frequently, sometimes not, as a kind of mediator, broker, go-to person that people know who can sometimes, I'm asked by counterparts in government to represent anthropology or represent the issues of anthropology around these questions, a goal or a hat I tend to try to resist. Sometimes to facilitate, I think as you were just talking about, some greater forms of dialogue and exchange in certain cases among agencies and organizations and professional social science associations, where it would seem that that dialogue might be helpful and productive. Just to give you one really quick example of that, a couple of years ago, with the high point being late 2014, 2015, there was a series of destruction of cultural heritage sites by in Syria and Iraq, places like Nimrud and elsewhere, and it was not clear from within the military context how to respond to these concerns. And this was an ongoing problem that had, at least it came on their radar originally with the looting of the Baghdad Museum in 2003. And subsequently, the military has in different ways attempted to stand up resources to deal internally with this issue. But to do so, they need to understand fully kind of what's at issue around the meaning or significance of some of these cultural heritage sites. And it might range from things like lists of places not to bomb to ways of securing sacred sites, to ways of engaging with key counterparts in parts of the world who might be managing those sites, and a variety of other issues. And this was a kind of a conversation that it seemed to me made sense to have with military colleagues in a way that was quite different from other kinds of things that people might be asked to do, like the human terrain or something like that. And so we had a meeting at the Smithsonian that involved a lot of those folks, key stakeholders, around thinking up better ways to coordinate action toward the goal of sort of conservation or preservation of cultural heritage sites. That's just one small thing that I was brought into and asked to help facilitate. So that's something that's continued periodically, whether it's for sitting on a committee for the National Research Council or working with the American Association for the of the American Academy of Sciences, the Office of Naval Research, the Department of State's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, some of the national laboratories. There's a wide range of different kinds of problems around this issue in which I've now become some sort of expert that people frequently seek me out around of how do we use this issue of culture or incorporate cultural knowledge as a kind of problem-solving tool into what we are already doing. And sometimes those are successful exercises or conversations or engagements or dialogues, but I'm often as not reminded of the limitations of these exchanges. And I'd be happy to talk more about what I take to be some of those limitations. And I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to first say thank you to all of you. I'm just so struck by how much time and energy you have given to a project that you value as citizens. And you're not paid extra money to meet with someone and try to talk with them about the complexity of these ideas. So you really put yourself in a place of giving to a project that really had integrity for you and probably is under-recognized. So thanks for your work. We have, yes. I want to have some questions and conversations from the audience. Before we do that, I'm just going to do a little read through of some of the major themes, briefly, that I heard. I heard themes of morality and ethics. On the one hand, more knowledge, more nuance seems to be always a good, more religious literacy. On the other hand, we heard from Rob that we're not necessarily innocent when we participate in providing insight and information, and sometimes there are not ways that we can have transparent access to where our contribution is used. So I'm curious to talk a little bit more about ethics and morality. The very poignant question of does it matter, both the question of does it matter given the incoming Trump administration and its sort of erasure of a lot of competency, and then also the larger question of does it matter, or is it just perhaps a satisfying career or perhaps not, and we opt in or out based on personal preference? I'm interested in our thinking together about what would we tell Luce AAR about a next generation version of this, both as an output, what might be an audience, who would care, who would want to know, what would we want to say to them, not just as a series of academic reports, but maybe as a meta-analysis, because you've had a unique perspective on history. The ways in which this was sometimes unsatisfying, like you said at the end, Rob, these sort of one-off encounters. And is that the name of the game? Bureaucracies are massive, and educating is a slow process in the classroom and in civil society. And I liked the ways in which you each seemed to suggest that moving in and out of the classroom, light was a moment of illumination for you on what you had learned from a different kind of genre of thinking. That you learned what you had communicated in different terms in your memo had things to say about how you educated your students, and how you educated your students had things that informed the ways you talked to your colleagues. So those are areas I encourage us to come back to. Anyone in the audience want to speak? I wanted to introduce Peter Kovach, who's been in touch with us about his own work on religion in the State Department. And I see that the great Sean Casey is also here. Sean. Peter, do you want to tell us a little bit about your history? Just take a few minutes.
Yeah. Hello? Can you hear me? My perspective is kind of coming from an opposite direction, but agreeing with almost everything that's been said. I'm a recovering religion major, world religion major. Spent my junior year at Benares Hindu University. At first round of grad school was area studies, but again, I got very involved in the anthropology of religion and increasingly decided that being sort of a practical and engaging personality, that was my route. And I think it's the route that is more applicable to engagement with religious leaders, civil society, and values, I would add, in the service of secular foreign policy goals. I really subscribe to Rob's concerns about the instrumentalization, but at the same time, once you go into government, you know, you're sort of aboard with that, and you know, you can jump off the train. But it's a dilemma. It's there very actively in the mind. One of the great things that RGA, the structure that was stood up under Secretary Kerry and that Dr. Casey headed, accomplished was really pushing ahead the piece of training and socializing the need to engage religious civil society along with other elements in the societies we serve in. What prevents it? Obviously, I would say two things. One is that we're excessively rationalist in bureaucracies, even in non-democratic societies, evidence-based. You know, we're tough thinkers. If we have a strong spiritual background, we leave it in a little box by the door of the bureaucracy as we walk in. That's a bit of a problem. One of the things I've found in a career, a 30-year foreign service career, of engaging religious society is that I need to bring my own identity to the table tactically. The second thing, of course, is fear of the First Amendment, of that you'll overstep the bounds, that someone, you know, to stereotype a bit, either on the Christian right or the Madeleine Murray atheist element will go after you in court. I mean, early on in my career, two quick examples. One is I was in Yemen, and I was a little bit appalled at how my more experienced colleagues were engaging almost exclusively Yemenis that had been educated in the States, London, the Soviet Union, or Iraq. And I'm thinking, this is crazy. I didn't go through, you know, a year and a half of Arabic for this. So I went out and engaged both Muslim brotherhoods, the Sunni and the Zaydi, and eventually started placing some of our Arabic materials about America in their journals. We could not get our foot in the door in this fairly illiterate society of radio and television, which were the key media. Well, what happened was when these articles started appearing, the very secular Minister of Information called little junior me and said, "Peter, why can't we have equivalent TV and radio materials?" And I said, "Excellency, because I can't get my foot in the door of your radio and TV stations," which were very controlled by secular Baathists. And it was the Reagan administration where we were perceived to be so absolutely pro-Israel that they just didn't want to talk to us. That changed, and I got a grant from Washington and bought a lot of materials and placed them. Really changed our whole media profile in Yemen. In Bahrain, later on, after the Iranian Revolution, the Shia community, the majority Shia community, was very wary of us, but they were wary of us because they felt that we were lumping them with Iran at the time. They admired the United States. We integrated the oil company, which was segregated like the old Deep South, different bathrooms, different water fountains, different eateries. The first day American management took over, we integrated it. They never forgot that, and they valued our getting rid of a corrupt leader, and that was the Watergate stuff. They had their narrative of justice and around that. We had no contact as an embassy, so I noticed they were very big on sports clubs, so I brought a college basketball team out to scrimmage and coach and so forth. I brought a Division III brainy school team out where the kids would understand what they were there for, and that would legitimately lose a game or two to the clubs. They did, and it was bathed in publicity on TV and radio. And the embassy and also our military base there, which was not so secret presence, began to come down to the village majlises for weddings, funerals, and so forth, which is how I got into this. I started going down on my own.
So these tactics were ways of engaging religion on the ground. Yeah.
And this was in the 80s.
Yeah.
In the 90s, when I came back to Washington, we were fretting about political Islam after the first Gulf War, the 1991 Gulf War. And I remember these anguished seminars of academic experts, some of your professors maybe, who came and advised us. And I just suddenly decided that my habit of engagement needed to be put into policy. So I wrote a paper, and it got cleared and so forth, and went up to Ed Eurasian, who was our assistant secretary in the Near East Bureau, and he gave a speech at Meridian House in Washington, I think on June 2nd, 1992, that I'd essentially written, and it basically enjoined us to reach out to people that would talk to us, to be careful around people that were for one man, one vote, one time, but realize that in a way that the Muslim Brotherhood in its very various anthropological forms in different countries was almost the only civil society we had to interact with. And that doctrine kind of held until 9/11, when it was suddenly the silent majority. Okay, 98, the Religious Freedom Act was very, very big. It created an obligation of every embassy in the world to write this report. After 2001, the engagement became much too Islamocentric. I, in my last job in my career, headed the Religious Freedom Office at a time there was no RGA, there was no ambassador at large at the moment. So I did all those roles, and I really, I extracted, as kind of not a bribe for taking the job, but I extracted grant money to program religious civil society in conflict zones to work to overcome conflict, especially interfaith. I really believe in that. And then what was amazing is under the George Bush 43 administration, they started these structures of faith-based and neighborhood outreach offices in various bureaucracies. And that was actually started before 9/11. That was a very positive development. It went a little too far domestically, as some of you may remember, but it kind of gave us an engagement structure, and then some key regulations were rewritten that enabled us overseas to engage religious civil society when appropriate as program partners, not just interlocutors. Okay, that was very important. It let the civil society organizations compete on a level playing field with secular organizations for grants. It allowed us to, if they got a grant, they had to separate the activity that was funded in either time or place from a worship activity. That's very key. They had to include people that did not worship in their congregation if they were in the purview of the grant. And if we were going to build a structure, we would only pay for it in the percentage it was to be used for the grant activity. You know, suddenly First Amendment-itis, as I call it, receded, because there was a structure of regulation and you knew you were protected.
Peter, I think you've got a book in you.
Okay.
I think you've got a book proposal. You could definitely contribute to the history of this institution. There's a lot of change that you've lived through and you've been part of.
It's amazing.
Do you have any?
RGA did such important work. They established the need for social mapping of the religious civil society terrain in all the places we work. They pushed the training piece, and I absolutely agree with Evan that that it should be basically anthropological training, how the tradition is lived, how it's cumulatively and progressively been interpreted. But at the same time, you have to give people in this very secular institution some sense of the essentials. But it's got to be in an anthropological context, I would say. I hope that continues. I hope that some of the work that was started, and all of it, continues and gets richer. I'll stop here, but I'd be very interested in talking to all of you and any of you that are interested later.
Well, thank you also for your service.
And thank you to RGA and what they accomplished. It really was a jewel in a crown, but one that I see as almost a 40-year progression.
Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. So I wanted to jump in on some of the questions about normativity and ethics that have sort of cropped up in the course of the conversation, and think a little bit about sort of how we're locating that question across a couple of different spaces. So one thing I take to heart in Peter's comments is the ways in which civil servants and foreign service officers have long struggled with issues of sort of how to incorporate religious knowledge and information into governance, right? That there's a sort of one perspective on this issue that has to do with bringing on board religious knowledge and understanding and engagement into a quote-unquote secular federal context. Another way to think about how we locate that question across a set of actors is to think about the relationship between academic knowledge production and government service, right? And I think that Rob's remarks were really helpful in framing that in the context of a very particular, somewhat contentious set of developments in anthropology and a set of programs in which anthropologists were not necessarily of one mind about sort of military-funded utilization of their work. I think that when we switch the conversation to one about the relationship between religious studies as a discipline, as a body of knowledge and scholarship, and relationship to government service, we have a sort of unique set of questions. And so here, we're essentially asking about the relationship between theory and practice, between knowledge and advocacy, between deconstruction and construction. You can frame this in a variety of different ways. And I think that one thing that we might want to submit for sort of collective consideration is the particular vexed relationship that those categories have in the study of religion, in large part stemming from the tensions between religious studies and theology as two sort of dyadic partners in a long-standing disciplinary enterprise, right? So I think one of the issues that we often find is that scholars of religion and this is based on personal experience, this is based on a panel we had last night, this is based on conversations I've had with folks about this fellowship last year, really that folks in religious studies are reticent to sort of think of what they do as advocacy-based, as having sort of coherent pathways to application in the public sphere. And I think that's an interesting question. I think so. Part of that skepticism, to my mind, rises because of the ways in which religious studies understand itself as a we teach about religion, we don't teach religion, right? There's something I think inherent in that formulation of who we are as a field that has sort of a set of self-imposed limitations about sort of what does and does not count as quality scholarship in the field. I'd like to submit that self-understanding to a little bit of critical scrutiny, right? I mean, you don't hear people using the construction applied religious studies. You hear people using the construction, the public understanding of religion, and it's clear that people mean different things by that, right? So who are our publics? What are the modes of public engagement? Are certain modes of public engagement of religious studies scholarship somehow more or less valuable, more or less ethically fraught? And I think one of the critical pieces to this for me, and I think Rob was pointing very directly to this issue, is that when our work is harnessed to sort of public objectives or advocacy issues that go beyond, or governance issues that go beyond sort of the normal sphere of academic work, we get squeamish as if that is somehow, and I think Elizabeth used this word, contamination of something that is actually our enterprise, right? And that, to me, hinges on the presupposition that our work was somehow not contaminated to begin with, right? That exists in a laboratory in which our gloves are always sterile and we sort of operate in a contagion-free zone. And I find that a really problematic model of thinking about the way that academic work is produced and then consumed in a sphere, the ivory tower perhaps, that it's somehow isolated from social impact more broadly, right? So the classroom is clearly one space where I would like to think that it's contagious, right? Not just that I have a cold right now, but I really hope my students are catching something, and I hope that it goes on to impact them outside the classroom. And I also think of my research like that more generally, right? We would all want our work, well, maybe I take that back. We wouldn't all want, but I think many people writing and researching in the field of religious studies would want our work to be read by broader audiences and to sort of bring those ideas to bear on their comportments and their sort of public understanding of issues, and maybe even to be taken up in more formal, actionable ways in the public sphere, right? So that's sort of a series of shades of gray there based on how we frame that, and I think it's important to think about our positionality in that larger milieu, right? Are we we approaching those questions and those dynamics as public policymakers? Are we approaching those questions and dynamics as members of a discipline that has a particular kind of frame around those issues? Or are we thinking about them somehow as actors on the in-between? And I think one of the advantages of the folks up here on the panel is that all of us in various ways have sort of been in the mix on that conversation in ways that sort of destabilize our identity as having sort of a specific location in one of those nodes, right? I don't think of myself, and I can't really think of myself fairly anymore as existing in the laboratory space, and I can't really think of myself anymore as existing sort of purely in a public policy setting. So I think that I just want to submit that sort of specific religious studies perspective on this set of dynamics. So, yeah, please.
Just to quickly augment what Evan was saying, thinking of the publics we might have in mind primarily in terms of public policy, and then considering the value or utility of a form of regular engagement in the mode of, we'll just use dialogue between disciplines like anthropology or religious studies and government. Of course, we're massively simplifying. There's this monolithic entity government, but that's in fact, of course, not true. What is really the case are a multiplicity of variegated priorities and organizations and entities, not always all on the same page with one another, engaged in a variety of projects, some of whom might be reaching out to you for particular concerns or goals, others of which might be looking for some other kind of thing. So one of the challenges I think that I found with my colleagues in anthropology has been the tendency to view the problem in broadly monolithic terms. And so when an invitation for some kind of collaboration occurs, it is understood broadly to be globally implicated in a set of things that maybe it doesn't make sense to view it in those terms. In the other direction, I think one of the things that we often are aware of, and several of the panelists have mentioned this, is the idea that there are certain kinds of value added that academics bring to their work in these settings, one of which is nuance and context and so on. But I think it's a reasonable question to ask of colleagues when you're being asked to work with them, whether or not there really is room for nuance and context in circumstances where what you're being asked to do is really very specifically, as Peter was saying, instrumentalized for the purpose of A, B, C. And sometimes those are purposes that you might view as legitimate or appropriate or possible. Other times they might be purposes that are not in keeping with your professional identity or the ethical framework within which you work as a professional social scientist of one sort or another. And I think that it's actually useful to really consider, when thinking about where these kinds of collaborations and engagements might be valuable or possible, the extent to which you have a reasonable degree of agency in that environment to enact something of value. And just to end that, in thinking on some of the things that Evan said, and just adding a further element, there's one of the things that often happens with anthropology, particularly when it's asked to provide, kind of cultural expertise, is the problem of the concept of culture and what we understand that to be when it gets operationalized in these settings. And there really is a problem I would describe as of temporalities. Oftentimes, and with great frequency, it is the case that counterparts with whom one is asked to work are operationalizing a concept of culture that is either obsolete or antiquated or utterly out of step with where disciplinary contemporary practice and theory is. And you're now being asked to talk about something that, in fact, from your point of view, is already deeply problematic, and or work with categories of knowledge that you might already have moved beyond or critiqued. At the same time, it's a situation that I'm happy to admit where what anthropology has done with the concept of culture over the last 20, 25 years is to make it in some significant degree unintelligible or illegible to policymakers. In the kind of 90s going forward critique of culture, And as that discipline has moved away from this concept, it becomes less available as part of a constructive dialogue that you can have with interlocutors in these different walks of life. So there are different forms of intelligibility and lack of intelligibility or legibility, and also I think different limits on the art of the possible around what can happen in these dialogues. And I was just suggesting that one good litmus test is whether or not and to what extent you feel like you're going to have the kind of agency you need to enact kinds of things that are consistent with where you understand your discipline and your professional identity to be at.
Thanks. Jerome, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I actually want to begin with something I probably should have began with, which is a disclaimer, and we're no longer working for the U.S. government. We're not speaking for the U.S. government. All opinions that we express today are our own and do not represent the views of the U.S. government. With that said, our work at the Office of Religion and Global Affairs was based on a belief, and that belief was that a understanding of religion, of religious communities, of religious traditions, of religious dynamics on the ground is useful to the work of diplomacy. And we believe, I think that, the ethical question that I faced in taking this job was, A, do I think that's the case? And B, do I think that the work of diplomacy is something that I think I should be involved in? And I answered yes to both of those questions. And I think it's important to realize that diplomacy is not simply government-to-government interactions. And the majority of the work that we did, I think, in the Office of Religion and Global Affairs was to work with people on the ground in the countries that we have presence in, to work with civil society, with NGOs, with religious actors and non-religious actors, and to realize that this work is not something that is going to yield results immediately. That when we reach out and work with the youth group or university students, we're not striving to have an immediate impact, but we're looking at relationships that will grow slowly and perhaps bear fruit years down the line. So there's, on the one hand, there was the attempt to brief diplomats and public servants who are going out into the field so they could understand the map that they're participating in better. But the other side of our work was to really help build relationships and help build relationships with non-governmental organizations, with civil society organizations, with religious organizations, that we could then understand those communities better and they could understand the United States and the United States policy better. And I would also like to agree with what Evan just said about the relationships between how to sort of mediate the kind of knowledge that we have as academics to this governmental situation. There is an ivory tower, although I don't know if the tower is really ivory. But I don't think that we should consider ourselves, even in the work that we do in the university and in the classroom, to be pure and uncontaminated by the world. I think that would be a big mistake, especially in the realm of knowledge that's religious studies, which is about the complexity and dirtiness of the world.
Echoing certainly what was said about this is not uncontaminated work, or I said it earlier that I'm not neutral on the topic of Islamophobia when I research it. Heaven forbid anyone would be. It is a form of engaged scholarship, and I made my peace with that long before I stepped foot in the State Department. That I'm engaged in engaged scholarship, and there is certainly a place for that. And in terms of philosophically, I don't side with the camp in the academy that we need to be engaged in something that's neutral. I don't know how you can make a case for neutral scholarship, and not just on Islamophobia. We all have various interests that come to bear on the very questions we ask in any discipline that we're engaged in. The other thing that comes to mind, this question of morality and the challenges that you face in doing this kind of work, is I kept reflecting last year on to whom am I accountable? Which communities am I accountable to? As a professional, as a scholar of religion, well, I am accountable to this guild, the Academy of Religion. You are one of my communities that I'm always thinking about when I do my research, when I do my writing and public speaking and other forms of academic writing. What are the standards of scholarship? What constitutes, sound scholarship in terms of methodology? And how do you, appropriately translate that into the work that you do? Obviously, that has to be a factor here. I would like to think that's one of the things that separates me from the professional Islamophobe Robert Spencer. He does not feel accountable to you. And so he still claims the mantle of expertise, and there are lots of other things that separate that gentleman from me. But that certainly is one of them in terms of to whom are we accountable. But I am not only accountable to you and to my colleagues here. I am accountable to other communities. And have other commitments. And they all come together in who I am and how I do my scholarship. And amongst those are my interfaith commitments and my commitments to my fellow Muslim citizens and residents and sisters and brothers and others who are very much affected by Islamophobia. Islamophobia is not just about negative opinions, it's about people's lives and livelihoods. I'm not neutral in that, and I have commitments to those communities, and I'm a U.S. citizen. I have certain commitments, I suppose, because I'm a U.S. citizen, right? All of that comes to bear on the work that I do, and maybe it complexifies the work, it makes it more difficult, but it also is something that, again, just reminds me that there's a lot shaping the questions I ask, the scholarship that I do, and how it bears upon, in this case, at the State Department Foreign Policy, that I must keep in mind, and when I think through the moral implications of this work that I've been doing.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Just as a general observation, I would say that, we've been talking a lot about sort of professional ethics questions and accountability issues. In some ways, as though these are new issues when it comes to the relationship between, in this case, government and government service and the academy, and yet, I think if we were to historicize the question, we would see that it is nothing new. I mean, if we think about the history of area studies in particular during the Cold War in this country, and we think about Cold War studies and East European studies, the establishment of some of the best programs in East European history in this country at the start of the Cold War, area studies programs to understand the Middle East during really in the middle part of the latter century, we will see, what is self-evident, which is that the United States government has actually funded many programs in the academy. And so these are kind of long-standing questions, and I think we're just going through the latest iteration of those in this conversation. And in some ways, I think, the broader question for us in terms of our professional ethics and academics is to recognize what has been the steady creeping corporatization of the American Academy, which means that, as we all know as academics, it means a certain kind of orientation when it comes to how we think about or the kinds of expectations that are imposed upon us as academics when it comes to grant monies and numbers of students, et cetera. So I think, the kind of experiences that we've had, and I can speak for myself, but the kind of experience I've had in diplomatic service in the policy arena simply has sharpened my overall awareness of the need to think about the ways in which accountability questions get raised in terms of the independence or putative independence of our scholarship. The other thing I would say is that oftentimes I think in asking these questions as academics, we think about the impact of the policy world on what we do. I think, again, we haven't recognized fully, at least in this space of engagement between religion and foreign policy, we haven't really recognized the profound impact of the knowledge regimes that we use in the way in which policy has been designed. I mean, the language of secularization continues to be hegemonic. It's more examined, I would say. I mean, we wouldn't all be sitting here if it weren't, in terms of the foreign policy establishment, but the working assumptions about, which religions are, inherently violent, which religions are not, which religions are, modernizable and modernized and modernizing, which faith traditions can generate democratization. I mean, I think, if nothing else, Huntington's Clash book and the Clash articles in the 90s, and then, accompaniments like Kaplan's Bulk and Ghosts. I mean, these are books that basically, help to give a kind of new formulation to traditional modernization theory. And so the life, the life cycle of the kinds of knowledge regimes that we use in the academy and the impact on the policy world, I think, is something that we really haven't come fully to terms with. And I think it not only affects the kind of policy choices that, we consider in terms of religion and US foreign policy, but it shapes what questions even get asked, which ones even get on the table. And I think that for me was a very, for me it was something that I feel like was a gift from the work that I've done in Washington. It's made me far more attuned and self-critical in terms of the language that I use and the way my students are going to take that out into the policy space. So I think that the awareness issue and the professional ethics issue is needs to be historicized, and we need to broaden the way we think about it. And then finally, I would also like to come back to this point about timeline. I think the policy space is about deliverables, and elected officials want wins, and they want them now, and so they want deliverables that they can measure or present as measurable. And I think one of the things that I came to understand in terms of the work that I did was that without a long view and without some sort of, I guess I would say patience and persistence, the kinds of thorny, complex questions that are both, have positive and negative valence when it comes to religion and security, religion and human security in particular, those really do require the long view. And I don't know, how you solve that in our world, but I think without recognizing that, it's going to be a long slog on some of these issues, the policy choices are not going to produce the outcomes that we would anticipate and expect.
Does anybody in the audience want to ask a question or make a contribution? Yeah. Can you introduce yourself first, please?
Yes. Hi. My name is Christine Hutchison-Jones. I'm the chair of the new Applied Religious Studies Committee here at AAR. And so I'd really like to pick up on something that Elizabeth said when she was speaking earlier about how we need to help graduate students see beyond the false dichotomy between scholarship and public policy. You're all scholars working in the academy who have, to use a phrase someone used on a panel I was at yesterday, had sort of a side hustle going in public policy, right? I wonder how you see yourselves helping students, A, overcome the idea that it's an either or, and B, for students who actually might be interested in moving outside of the academy, whether it's because of the job market or because of just personal inclination, what are the things that you're doing to help direct them toward the kind of work that you think religious studies and anthropology outfit us for in policy spaces? And what resources do you see out there? I mean, even going back to how did you find the positions that you've been in policy spaces yourselves?
So I think that's a great question. We had a panel last night on sort of conversations between international relations, political science, religious studies as a set of, as a context for the classroom largely, right? Like what is it that we're hoping to do for students who are working to bridge those bodies of knowledge in their professional development trajectories? And I think there's a lot more to say when we're thinking about sort of at the classroom level. As an educator who works at a DC-based institution, these are very immediate questions, right? My students imagine, I think, immediately after graduation going into policy making or the policy sphere generally. And I think that many of the graduate students that we work with imagine like either inside the Beltway, there's the side hustle issue works both ways, right? There's a lot of people who work in the policy arena and have a side hustle in the academic sphere, and vice versa too. So, I mean, in terms of finding those positions, I think those are often network-based. I mean, this particular set of fellowships was advertised widely in sort of AAR-based materials, but there's lots of other opportunity like this. If you sort of follow if you sort of get hooked into think tank networks or to various circles like that. So I think it is about having networks, and I think that those networks can be really valuable for us as educators in helping keep our students connected to internship opportunities, to events at think tanks, because those, they're immediate, right? They're real and human networks.
Okay. In terms of what I do with my students as a political scientist and at a place like Fletcher, and before I was at Fletcher, I was at BU in the International Relations Department, where they had a program on IR and religion. Before that, as a postdoc, then teaching at the Woodrow Wilson School. So in places, again, that are kind of interdisciplinary and I guess, you know, scholar practitioner spaces. But for students of political science who are interested in religion, first of all, I just encourage them to not be intimidated and dissuaded from their interest in the study of religion, and for you know, careers and professional opportunities that deal with religion. And I think they need that encouragement oftentimes, because people who work on religion and political science oftentimes do get treated as though they're sort of working on this little interesting kind of cottage, you know, subject, and it's really not fully mainstreamed. Or they may be, or there's the kind of lingering sense that, you know, if you work on religion, you must be religious. You must have a religious agenda. And so I speak these things openly for students to examine them and also sort of get a sense of whether they're active in their own student environments or the classroom, so that, you know, they can more easily explore things that might be of interest to them. I try to help them find the intersection of, I guess, what I would call interesting, meaningful, and lucrative. I mean, that's what most students want today, right? I mean, if you can sort of hit that trifecta, I guess, you know, your life is good, you know. So I help them sort of think about the ways that they can do that. And most importantly, I think I press them to, you know, recognize the way that ideas matter. And they're presumably in grad school because they understand that ideas are important, and what are the ideas that they think are going to most shape their lives and they want to sort of explore in terms of the professional work they do. And then the final thing is, I also encourage them to think a lot about the fact that, you know, the academy and, you know, public policy or diplomacy, they're both forms of service. I mean, you know, I may be a sort of, you know, outdated dinosaur. I mean, the reason I you know, was drawn to the academy is because I loved teaching, and for me it was a way to serve and to offer. And so, you know, I think there's a real compatibility and overlap in that Venn diagram, and helping students to recognize the service dimension, you know, of the academic and the policy space is useful, particularly for those who are interested in religion, and where that may seem quite intuitive then. If you're, you know, interested in religious practitioner work or NGO work, I mean, service is intrinsic to that. So those are the things that I really sort of help them, push them to think about. And then I just encourage them in terms of professional associations to be broad and to cross boundaries. And 9 times out of 10, students are very excited about what they discover.
If I could just subscribe to a lot of what Elizabeth is saying in particular, the part of my religion major education that I didn't talk about is essentially the most important part. I did phenomenology of religion in addition to studying aspects of the Dharmic religions on an anthropological level. That is so important because you develop an awareness of your own thinking and your own perception of what you're encountering. And it's evolution as you change, as you accumulate experience. That is so essential, I think, in diplomacy to engaging not only faith-based civil society, but almost anyone cross-culturally. And it's an essential toolbox. So I would say that in addition to being aware of your own spirituality or lack of it when you go into an encounter, I think it's very important that you have this constant view of yourself and how you're viewing the world, because sometimes subjectivity and intersubjectivity is far more important than doctrine, given essentials of a situation, whether it's diplomatic or in a religious tradition. So phenomenology of religion.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for all this input. My question is, I heard a couple of you talk about using your sabbatical time for this. And so I have two questions around that. For people who are at institutions who expect kind of, the traditional product from your sabbatical of a book or whatever it might be, how did you account for the productivity of your sabbatical time to your administration, your committees? And then secondly, around timing, particularly with the AAR-Luce Fellowship position, you guys might not have known, I don't think you did, until maybe a year before that you were going to be doing this. So then when you kind of submitted your sabbatical plan, assuming that's a requirement at your university, how did you do that? What did that look like? Thank you.
I'll say one thing about timing and government service. In the positions that we had, we needed to acquire security clearance. And this complicates the issue of timing, because security clearance is not something that that happens overnight. Happens over many nights, many months of nights, and it could go anywhere from 6 weeks to a year, year and a half to achieve your security clearance. So in order to do the kind of work that we were doing, there needed to be a built-in flexibility to start when we were cleared, start when they were ready to have us, rather than the usual, we'll start September to August situation. So that's a complicated wrinkle. I think we should just sort of talk about just at the very beginning.
So I got to be the inaugural Luce Fellow because my security clearance paperwork came through slightly before Jerome's.
Yeah, you were less problematic than me, I guess.
I had put on the forms that I had not met with any Russian oligarchs, and in fact, he is one. So
just on TV.
Only on TV, though. So at any rate, I think that's a great question. This is, in many senses, in many ways, a practical set of questions, right? So first, I have an advantage of working for an institution that places particular value on government fellowships. This is sort of not a standard practice, but a common practice in sort of DC area institutions and public policy schools. Even though it's not as common in the College of Arts and Sciences at American University, there are clear models for the ways that those fellowships are reviewed by deans in tenure processes. So this is a post-tenure fellowship, and I had sort of in my sabbatical proposal paperwork imagined the kind of a book that would emerge from this, which in the version that was proposed there would have been a relatively linear development of the work that I had been doing in article form immediately before the sabbatical, buttressed and expanded by interaction with some of the same groups that I had been working with as a researcher vis-a-vis a position in government, right? So to sort of be able to think about the policy space I'd already been writing about, but to have another perspective on it. I'm not gonna write that book. And so part of my issue in sort of the post-fellowship period has been sort of how do I make sense of that as something that is added to my professional experience portfolio? I'm not totally settled on that matter. I think I learned quite a bit, and I don't think that I will be writing directly out of it in the way I had anticipated up front, right? So I think that we can all be honest that when you tell your department or your deans or whoever what your plan is for a sabbatical, and when something different happens, you know, a few years down the line, when the project actually begins to get realized, people are not surprised about that, right? So that nonlinear relationship is probably going to have to be perfectly fine. In terms of the question about timing, the cycle of the fellowship proposal ended up being that applications were during the summer, that the fall, once the process was sort of wrapped up in September and October, I guess that was of 2015, there was a period of time in the fall semester that was the security clearance time, and I ended up having to make some arrangements to have my sabbatical for a calendar year as opposed to for an academic year. And you know, there are logistical hassles about that, but they were foreseeable given the timing of the application cycle, and my institution was willing to work with me on those because I was like, you could set that up in advance. So I feel lucky that things fell into place the way they did, but it requires foresight and juggling.
Yeah, so I had to go through the same process, and my security did take a little longer, so it actually delayed the start of my my fellowship in a little bit, and I had to tinker with the timing of it. And fortunately, on the State Department side, they're flexible in that, so you could do 12 months, you can do slightly shorter. In theory, you could go longer, and so that helped a bit, but it did affect my start date. And so on your end, you have to think about things like that when you do this. Okay, good. In terms of the product of a sabbatical, when I was doing a sabbatical plan, you know, I teach at a liberal arts college, so they're more than happy if you have a book or some articles coming out of this. And I do have a book coming out next year that was written partially during my sabbatical, though not necessarily based directly on my State Department work. The book was conceived prior to me entering the State Department, and I would have written it whether I did this fellowship or not. But what I put in my sabbatical plan was about coursework and teaching, and how would I come back to my campus and how this would affect my teaching. Some of it in terms of adjusting current courses I teach. I teach a course on Islamophobia. It's a survey course on it. I'm teaching it now this fall. What does that look like that's different? You know, and I mentioned some ways I hope this could change aspects of that teaching. What I assign, trying to do a little bit more of the applied aspect of responding to Islamophobia from a policy perspective. And so we've done some of that work in the classroom that's similar to the kinds of conversations I had at the State Department, and I wouldn't have been able to pedagogically translate that in the same way had I not done this work. I also teach a study abroad course in Islam in Europe. Just to be in the most obvious way, I made connections and developed relationships in my work at the State Department that will directly have an impact on the planning I do or I am doing for a course I will conduct in January and in future years on Islam in Europe, where I go visit. I'm interacting a little bit more with embassies now as I plan that course. Prior to my State Department work, I usually didn't reach out to embassies for assistance. You know, actually, I found in many cases the embassies are more than willing to be a bridge for you in terms of planning that kind of coursework if you want to do study abroad, or have study abroad being something that comes out of this. So that's how I made the case for the sabbatical in terms of how it would come back to Luther College where I teach, how it would affect Luther College, how it would affect our students, and finally, how would it help me as a mentor to undergraduate students. Going back to the previous question, you know, what can you do with a religious studies major or minor, or just any student who engages to some degree in the academic study of religion as an undergraduate? And I wanted to be able to be better as a mentor in terms of the conversations of getting past the assumption that you only study religion if you're interested in religious professionals, like, you know, be a member of the clergy or whatnot, which a lot of undergraduates assume that. You know, this was a way to help, and it continues to be a way to help undergraduates at my institution understand the applied aspects of the study of religion. What can you do with it? Well, here was one thing I did with it, right? And whoa, it'd be great if you could go into this work and instead of it being a year, you spend your career in the State Department with the academic credentials in the study of religion, and then applying that to policymaking, amongst many other possibilities. So making that case in an institution that values teaching, and what they really want to see out of sabbatical is how will this affect your teaching, and how will it affect our students? I found the institution quite supportive of me doing this and very encouraging, even though I didn't have the Washington network in Iowa.
Yeah, another question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. This has been a very enriching panel. I really appreciate it. My name is Carol Ferrara. I'm a late-stage graduate student in anthropology, actually, at Boston University. And so I actually have two quick questions. One is for Todd, because you told us all about this new term that you came up with, but you didn't tell us what the term was for radical Islamic terrorism. So I'd love to hear that. But also, I am curious, so this sort of goes on the question that was posed before, and what do you tell your students? So as a late-stage graduate student who also works as an adjunct, and I'm definitely not the only one, I see this really problematic corporatization of the university system that's been mentioned, you know, and the problems also obviously with the government. And so in hindsight, what would you recommend for a graduate student in this sort of anthropology, this intersection of anthropology, religion? Maybe we also have some experience in Washington. Where do you go? Do you go into academia, or do you go into a career in the government? Since you have the luxury of doing both, if you have to make a decision about career path, what would you recommend? Thank you.
I was wondering if someone would ask me that. And I've been asked before, because I allude to it, and I have some ambivalence about should I talk about the kind of work I was doing in the Trump administration in this regard. It wasn't, you know, security, classified meetings or anything along those lines. So in theory, it's fair game. But I apologize if I just say that. Yeah, I'm decided not to make public what I told the Assistant Secretary of State. And yet I still want to put it out there as a challenge that I had in terms of what 2 or 3 word phrase do you use that will work in you know, a deliverable, right? That will work in a government context that could be heard by maybe the Secretary of State and others. That's not offensive to Muslims, or not as offensive to Muslims. I think we even got to that conversation. You know, the grades of offensiveness. That would undermine completely engaging Muslim communities. So those conversations were pretty lively. But I do remember he was always very specific. He didn't want to know my personal opinion about what I thought was the best phrase. He wanted to know what I thought could be used in a way that would be heard, recognizing that my first sort of take on this was, well, almost all of it's problematic. Even countering violent extremism is a problematic phrase. And you know, that was the academic in me, and he quickly said, yeah, I get it. But I can't go in there with that, you know. So, yeah, I'm going to keep the rest of that between me and the Assistant Secretary, I think, just in terms of some confidentiality. But it was a very difficult assignment to receive, given that most of what I thought would be heard had to include some synonym with Islamic or radical, right? And or even terrorism, and I was pushing back on a lot of that, but it was very clear that in the current administration, they were wanting something that pushed in that direction that I personally and professionally was uncomfortable with. But if I'm there to give advice, then I have to come up with something. I'll pass on the anthropology question to others.
I feel like I should answer since I'm the resident anthropologist on the panel. I'm uncomfortable offering career advice, so I'm not going to go that direction. You know, things look differently in DC as compared, I think, to other, you know, metropolitan regions for the obvious reasons. And in that specific context, you know, when we say government, it's I think actually not helpful, because it doesn't really give one a sense of where specifically that might be and what specifically your activities might include and so on. So just to give you an idea of how one might go about thinking about that, and then I'm happy to talk more with you. You know, if you are someone like me who's, you know, cultivated this kind of expertise along this frontier of the intersection of culture with policy along different arenas of engagement in military, science and technology, diplomacy, humanitarian response, human rights, and so on, there are a variety of different government and non-governmental settings for that kind of work. Parenthetically, you might know that the U.S. is unusual in not having a Ministry of Culture. We have instead a potpourri and like a collection of cultural organizations and agencies. I mentioned one, which was the Educational Cultural Affairs in the Department of State, but there's the Smithsonian, there's the Library of Congress, there's the NEA, the NEH, there's and so on, so there's a sort of distributed approach to kind of where questions of cultural expertise might be located there. And so the first step is to kind of decide what is an issue or a topic or a concern of mine, and how does that get distributed across government and non-governmental work, and try to be systematic about that. Like what does that map look like? That organizational map, and then that I think is sort of the first step to considering where you might want to train more of your attention. Yeah.
And I wanted to extend my compassion. It's a tough job market, and it's hard to get into the State Department right now. There are just not a lot of easy ways to onboard, and it's hard to make a living as you develop your networks and figure out where your expertise can be used. So keep your chin up and keep in your community that loves you and values you, knows how smart you are as you make your way.
Can I offer something? Yeah, I think it's important to be entrepreneurial as an about to finish PhD, whether you stay in the kind of strict confines of the academy or go outside. And I think again the direction of the academy is in terms of entrepreneurialism. I think the intense corporatization of the academy and which is expressed in the pervasiveness of adjuncts, which are really a form of indentured servitude, is something that is to the detriment of what the academy is supposed to be about. And so my advice to you, both as an academic and also as a woman, is that you recognize that the things that inspired you to study anthropology can probably be applied in a wide variety of spaces, and to think entrepreneurially about those spaces and creatively about those spaces, because at the end of the day, the work that you're going to do as an intellectual can happen in so many different contexts, but it can only happen well if you have security and feel dignity. And I think those are things that are far too under-discussed with students as they enter and exit PhD programs. So be confident and make the choice that works for you, because then you'll be able to do the kind of work that you want.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Abadian, and I am a Franklin Fellow at the State Department. I'm the next generation, and an American Academy of Religion Luce Fellow as well. And I just wanted to introduce myself, because I can imagine I can learn a lot from all of you. I've already spoken a little bit to Jerome and briefly to Todd on phone, but I would love, I'm also an anthropologist and a political economist. I have multiple backgrounds and hats, and very interested in how I can be effective in the short span of time that I have, because I've been there now a few months. I feel like I've just been putting my anthropologist hat on all this time, getting to know the terrain and this environment that I'm in. As it's changing, even as it's evolving. So also, Peter, I'm in the IRF office, International Religious Freedom. So I would love to learn from all of you. I have only, it feels, I know you guys felt this possibly, I feel like it's such a short span of time. And I want to, be effective as much as I can, make a difference, as I know you all did and wanted to do. So just wanted to introduce myself instead of coming to you individually and saying this is who I am. So thank you for also, I know what it took for you guys to be there, and the service that you did. So I appreciate that a lot.
Well, we have another 5 minutes. Want to take the last question?
Sure. Thank you all again for your service and for your speaking today. It's been very, very interesting and helpful. I was struck by the discussion of the Commission on Religious Freedom and this idea that the U.S. is monitoring what's going on in religious freedom with all of these different countries. And to me, my instinct was, isn't that Human Rights Watch? Isn't that the UN? I was surprised that the US government was doing that, which made me think about, in your experiences in policy in the State Department, how are people discussing the role of the United States and the assumption that people make about the US? And are those assumptions, as have been alluded to, sometimes the assumptions that we come in with are unspoken and sometimes they are spoken and discussed and dissected. So I just wanted to know, was that going in the work that you've done in policy talked about and examined, or did people just come in with assumptions and those assumptions are embedded in that institution and it wasn't examined?
When I first came on board in the summer of 2016, this was in the midst of you remember the Burkini controversy in France and the various French towns and regions banning basically Muslim women from wearing too much clothes in certain public spaces. And I remember having internal conversations both in my offices and with a few people outside my office about that. And well, how should the United States respond to that was sort of a question. And I remember another office higher up the chain saying, well, the United States should not make a public statement about that in terms of religious freedom. Maybe that's something to do behind the scenes with France, because France is an ally. But you know, we don't name and shame our allies. And I immediately thought, well, we have an entire international religious freedom report that, if you want to be cynical about it, could be all about naming and shaming, right? But who do we get to name and shame, and then when is it not naming and shaming, but you know, it's working behind the scenes? And I found the whole paradigm problematic and the assumptions behind it problematic. But I remember I felt like I was sort of running against the wind on that one. I was like, well, you know, given what I did, to me this was a manifestation of Islamophobia. And you know, how might Muslim communities in France receive a message from the United States when it comes to standing by its professed commitments to freedom of religion, and what happens when we are silent on that because it happens to be an ally. And that was at a certain time, and eventually a statement of sorts did come out later. But I remember that the very dialogue sometimes inside the State Department around freedom of religion sometimes was difficult for me, because it seemed like there were some unexamined assumptions, including assumptions about the United States and its own track record, which is not necessarily, when we're engaged with foreign policy, the State Department's role, but to what extent did we have policies that exacerbated some of these challenges for freedom of religion? But I confess I was not very skilled at having those conversations initially. It took me a while, and maybe I didn't fully learn even after I left how to do that in a better way. But from the very narrow slice of policy work that I did, which was pertaining to Muslim communities in Europe, and which included freedom of religion, I did find it frustrating at times in terms of some certain assumptions that were made. But when we talk about Muslim communities in Europe, the countries that might have supported such policies, I felt sometimes are given a lot more latitude than if you have restrictions on freedom of religion in a Muslim majority context, where we would shout that out. But we couldn't shout that out when it came to France, and I felt disturbed by that, at least.
We're at 11:30, but I'm glad that a little community is formed here, and thank you all for your time and attention.